No living thing ever survived the horrors of planet X-47D. But that was before the humans dared to set foot on a world classified by the Sci aliens as Deathworld. Captain James Jones piloted the starship Dauntless through the darkness of deep space when the distress signal came through. It emanated from the infamous planet, a hellish place that crushed the life out of anything that tried to live there. Oppressive gravity 6 times Earth norm. A toxic miasma of an atmosphere. Storms that ripped across the surface, discharging massive bolts of lightning. Ferocious predators that could tear any creature to shreds. Jones's crew urged him to ignore the signal and stay far away from that terrible place. No one in their right mind would go to Deathworld. The technologically advanced Sci species avoided it like the plague, refusing to even enter the star system after deeming it a lost cause. Nothing was worth that risk. But James had to know if someone was stranded down in that nightmarish environment. As a human, he felt it was his moral duty to help, no matter the danger. He ordered the ship to set course for Deathworld over his crew's protests. They thought he was insane. This went against all logic and reason. As the Dauntless approached, scans picked up unidentified structures on the surface. Impossible. The sensors had to be malfunctioning, because if those readings were accurate, if someone had actually survived down there, then that defied everything known about X-47D. But no life signs registered. James knew he had to investigate. He assembled a team to take a shuttle to the surface, his first officer Mike, their medic David, and security chief Tom. They would go in search of answers and attempt to mount a rescue if needed. Armed with the best protective exosuits and equipment humanity had to offer, they embarked for the deadly surface. But nothing could prepare them for what they would find. The shuttle landed near the mysterious structures. Donning their suits and stepping out onto Deathworld, the humans were greeted by a devastating sight, the crumbling remains of some alien settlement. Chunks of advanced technology littered the cracked ground amidst toppled buildings. But no bodies. The whole place appeared to have been decimated by something catastrophic. Pressing forward with weapons ready, James and his team spotted an entrance to an underground bunker beneath the ruins. They headed down into the darkness, unsure what nightmare awaited them. There, they met the sole survivor, a lone Sci scientist named Oren, the last living member of the doomed attempt to colonize this terrible planet, and he was not happy to see humans. Oren regarded the Terran explorers with suspicion and hostility, his species both jealous and distrustful of the adaptable, indomitable humans spreading rapidly through the galaxy. James had to convince the alien that they came in peace, that he only wanted to help and understand what happened here. Oren reluctantly agreed to share the horrifying story. The context became clear. The Sci, in their scientific arrogance, thought they could tame Deathworld, that their technology could overcome any obstacle. They were dead wrong. The hellish planet had obliterated their fragile settlement, their equipment failing, their bodies broken by the punishing conditions, and in the process, they had awoken something. Some horror buried beneath the surface, a terror that even Oren struggled to describe. Now the humans had to uncover the truth behind the destruction of the Sci expedition and confront whatever nightmare this planet harbored before it could consume them as well. The distress signal still blared, taunting them, daring them to solve the mystery. No one could survive on Deathworld until the humans arrived. Oren led James and his crew deeper into the bunker, to a reinforced chamber that hummed with energy. There, suspended in a containment field, was an alien artifact unlike anything the humans had ever seen. It pulsed with an eerie glow, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change before their eyes. "This is what doomed us," Oren said, his voice heavy with regret. "We thought we could harness its power, but we were fools." James stepped closer, his eyes wide with wonder. "What is it?" "We don't know," Oren admitted. "But when we tried to interface with it, to study it, it triggered a catastrophic chain reaction." He brought up a holographic display, showing readings that spiked off the charts. The artifact emitted a massive energy pulse that interacted with Deathworld's already unstable environment. It unleashed hordes of predators that had been dormant deep underground. They slaughtered my people. James felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the readouts. But even in the face of such horror, his mind raced with possibilities. If they could figure out how to control this technology, to tap into its potential safely. He turned to Orin, a glint of drive in his eye. This artifact could be the key to everything, to understanding this planet, to harnessing its resources. We have to study it. Orin recoiled, shaking his head vehemently. No, it's too dangerous. I won't let you make the same mistakes we did. But James pressed on, undeterred. Orin, think about it. Your people failed because they worked alone. But if we combine human ingenuity with Sci knowledge, we might just crack this thing. Imagine what we could achieve together. The alien scientist hesitated, torn between fear and the tantalizing prospect of redemption. James laid a hand on his shoulder, his voice earnest. This could be the greatest challenge either of our species has ever faced, the ultimate test of our abilities. Are you really going to pass up that chance? For a long moment, Orin was silent. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, human. We'll try it your way. But if this goes wrong... Before he could finish, a sudden tremor rocked the bunker. Alarms blared as the containment field around the artifact flickered. James rushed to the console, his heart pounding. The energy pulse is spiking again, he shouted over the chaos. It's reawakening the predators. Orin's face drained of color as he stared at the readouts. We're trapped down here. They'll tear us apart. James grabbed a pulse rifle from the weapons rack, tossing another to Orin. Like hell they will. We're going to fight, and we're going to win. But first, we need to get this artifact stable. He turned to his crew, snapping out orders. Mike, David, help me fortify the entrance. Tom, you're on scanner duty. We need eyes on those bastards. As the humans scrambled to set up defenses, James pulled Orin aside. You're the expert on this thing. Tell me how to shut it down. Orin hesitated, then squared his shoulders. I have some ideas, but I'll need your help. And so, an unprecedented alliance was forged in the heart of Deathworld's darkest depths. A human captain and a Sci scientist working together to unravel the secrets of an ancient mystery, fighting side by side against the nightmare hordes. The odds were stacked against them. The body count was rising, but James and Orin had no choice but to trust each other, to draw on their combined strengths as they raced against time to save themselves and prevent an even greater catastrophe. Deathworld had thrown down the gauntlet. The humans and Sci had taken up the challenge. Only one would emerge victorious from this deadly game. The artifact's energy pulse intensified, sending waves of sickening power through the bunker. James gritted his teeth as the walls shook, dust raining down from the ceiling. Incoming! Tom shouted from his position at the scanner. Multiple hostiles closing fast. James sprang into action, his mind racing. Mike, David, shore up the eastern barricade. Tom, keep those scanners hot. Orin, I need you on the artifact. We have to figure out how to shut this thing down. The team moved with practiced efficiency, but James could see the fear in their eyes. They'd never faced anything like this before. A bone-chilling screech echoed through the corridors, followed by the sound of rending metal. The first wave of creatures burst through the outer defenses, a writhing mass of tentacles, claws, and gnashing teeth. Open fire! James yelled, unleashing a barrage from his pulse rifle. The air filled with the acrid smell of ozone as energy bolts tore into the advancing horde. For hours they fought. Wave after wave of nightmarish beasts threw themselves at the humans' defenses. James lost track of time, his world narrowing to the rhythmic thump of his rifle and the screams of dying monsters. We're running low on power packs, Mike called out, frantically reloading. Use whatever you can find, James ordered. Rip out the circuitry from the non-essential systems if you have to. As the battle raged, James and Orin worked feverishly to unravel the artifact's mysteries. Their fingers flew across holographic displays, decoding ancient symbols and analyzing energy patterns. It's not just a weapon, Orin muttered, his eyes wide. It's It's a terraforming device, or part of one at least. James frowned, studying the readouts. But why is it attracting these creatures? It's more than that, Oren said. Look at these bio readings. The artifact isn't just drawing them in, it's controlling them somehow, driving them into a frenzy. A plan began to form in James's mind. If we can reverse the signal, maybe we can... Are you insane? Oren interrupted. This technology is priceless. We can't just destroy it. Think of what we could learn, what we could accomplish. James smacked his palm on the console. Our lives are at stake here. We don't have time for... A deafening explosion cut him off. The main blast door buckled, torn from its hinges by a massive tentacled monstrosity. Forget the artifact, James shouted. Everyone, fall back to the inner chamber. They fought their way through the corridors, James and Oren providing covering fire as Mike and Tom half-carried the wounded David. They sealed themselves in the final room, the sounds of screeching and clawing just outside. As they caught their breath, Oren spoke up. There's something you should know, he said quietly. The Sci, we weren't just studying the artifact. We were trying to weaponize it, to use it to terraform other worlds by force. James stared at him in horror. Do you have any idea what you've done? If this technology falls into the wrong hands... I know, Oren replied, his voice heavy with regret. But that's not the worst of it. The artifact isn't just controlling these creatures, it's changing them, making them stronger, smarter. If we don't stop this soon... The implications hit James like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about their survival anymore. The entire galaxy could be at risk. We need a plan, James said, his mind racing. Something to neutralize the artifact and stop these creatures before they can spread. As they huddled together, formulating a daring plan, James couldn't help but marvel at the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. Humans and Sci, former rivals, now united in a fight for survival on the deadliest world in the universe. Whatever came next, they would face it together. James and Oren locked eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. They had to act fast. We can't destroy it, James said, his voice tight, but maybe we can control it. Oren nodded, already moving towards the artifact. If we can interface with its systems, we might have a chance. They worked feverishly, cannibalizing equipment from around the bunker to build a makeshift connection between the artifact and the computer core. James's hands flew over the controls, while Oren called out instructions. Try rerouting through the auxiliary power grid, Oren suggested. James complied, but as soon as he made the connection, the artifact pulsed with energy. The ground beneath their feet bucked and heaved. Shit, James yelled, grabbing onto a console to keep his footing. The tremors intensified. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as part of the ceiling collapsed. Mike, look out! James shouted. But it was too late. A chunk of debris slammed into Mike, pinning him to the ground. He cried out in pain. David, Tom, help him, James ordered. As David and Tom rushed to Mike's aid, another violent shake rocked the bunker. The floor split open between them, separating James and Oren from the rest of the crew. We'll find another way around, Tom called out, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. James turned back to the task at hand, gritting his teeth. They had to keep going. Finally, a flicker of alien script appeared on their display. They'd made contact with the artifact's systems. I can't make sense of this, James muttered, staring at the incomprehensible symbols. Oren leaned in, his eyes darting across the screen. It's heavily encrypted. Give me a minute. Before he could start decoding, an inhuman screech echoed through the bunker. The outer defenses had fallen. They're coming, James said, hefting his rifle. Work fast. I'll hold them off. He took up position at the chamber entrance, firing precise bursts at the writhing mass of tentacles and claws that poured through the corridor. Behind him, Oren's eyes suddenly went wide. James, he called out, this isn't what we thought it was. What do you mean? James asked, not taking his eyes off the advancing horde. It's not just terraforming tech, Oren explained. It's alive, or it was. It's some kind of biomechanical construct. Those energy pulses, they're a distress signal. James risked a glance back. So what do we do? Oren hesitated, conflict clear on his face. We might be able to rewrite its base code, take control. Then let's do it, James said firmly. As Oren worked, James fought off wave after wave of monstrosities. His arms ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't let up. Just when it seemed they might be overwhelmed, the artifact's glow changed. The creatures stopped in their tracks, suddenly docile. For a moment, all was quiet. Then the ground began to shake once more. Oren's face went pale. James, he said quietly, I think we may have made a terrible mistake. The ground beneath their feet lurched violently, throwing James and Oren off balance. Warning klaxons blared as the bunker's systems went haywire. James lunged for the nearest console, his fingers flying over the controls. Fuck, he spat, eyes widening at the readouts. Oren, look at this. The Sci-Fi scientist peered over his shoulder, face paling. No, it can't be. But the data didn't lie. Seismic activity was spiking off the charts, energy levels fluctuating wildly. James's mind raced, piecing together the horrifying truth. The artifact, he said, voice tight. When we overrode its systems, we must have triggered some kind of failsafe. It's not just affecting the local area anymore. This thing is tearing the whole damn planet apart. Oren's multifaceted eyes darted frantically across the screens. The energy matrix, he muttered. It's siphoning power directly from Deathworld's core. At this rate, the entire planetary structure will destabilize within hours. James smacked his palm on the console. We have to shut it down. Now. But before they could act, David's voice crackled over the comms. Captain, we've got problems up here. Med supplies are critically low and half the upper levels have caved in. We're trapped. Shit, James hissed. He turned to Oren. You're the expert. How do we stop this thing? The alien's face contorted with indecision. We can't, he said finally. Not without risking an even worse chain reaction. But there might be another way. James listened as Oren outlined his plan, his frown deepening with each word. That's insane, he said when the Sci-Fi finished. You want us to ride out a planetary apocalypse? The artifact was designed for terraforming, Oren argued. If we can access its full potential, use the stasis pods. And what about the mutants? James cut him off. You really think they'll just sit back and let us hibernate while the world burns? Their argument was interrupted by a weak voice. James. They turned to see Mike, pale and barely conscious, struggling to sit up. Do it, he rasped. Whatever it takes. Get us out of here. James nodded grimly, his decision made. Tom, he barked into his comm. Forget the artifact. Find us a way out. Now. But, Oren started to protest. James rounded on him. This isn't a debate. We're leaving. Fury blazed in Oren's eyes. Without another word, he stormed off deeper into the complex. Oren! James called after him, but another tremor rocked the bunker, nearly knocking him off his feet. There was no time to chase after the stubborn alien. He turned back to the others. David, grab Mike. We're moving out as soon as Tom finds us an exit. As if on cue, a thunderous explosion echoed from above. Dust and debris rained down as Tom's voice crackled over the comms. I've got a way out, but you're not going to like it. Before James could respond, an even louder impact shook the entire structure. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling as chunks of metal and concrete came crashing down around them. Move! James roared, hauling Mike to his feet with David's help. They staggered towards the exit Tom had cleared, each step a battle against the disintegrating bunker. As they reached the newly blasted tunnel, James looked back one last time, hoping to see Oren, but the Sci-Fi was nowhere in sight. With a silent curse, James turned and led his battered team into the gauntlet. They climbed through twisting corridors of broken metal and crumbling stone, each tremor threatening to bury them alive. Finally, they emerged into what had once been the bunker's upper levels. But where there should have been a ceiling, James saw only roiling clouds lit by sickly flashes of lightning. Massive chunks of debris rained down from above, pulverizing everything they touched. And in the distance, a shrill, inhuman shriek. The mutants were coming. James squared his shoulders, pulse rifle at the ready. "Stay close," he ordered his team. "We're getting off this rock if I have to carry each of you myself." With that, they plunged into the maelstrom, racing against time and the fury of a dying world. James's boots crunched on the crumbling rubble as he led his team through the disintegrating corridors of the Sci-Fi bunker. The air grew thick with dust and the acrid stench of melting metal. Behind him, Tom and David half carried the barely conscious Mike, his blood leaving a trail on the fractured floor. "Watch your step," James called back, his voice hoarse from the toxic fumes. "This whole place could come down on us any second." As if in response, a violent tremor shook the structure. Chunks of ceiling crashed down around them, forcing the group to scramble for cover. "There!" Tom shouted, pointing to a narrow gap in the debris. "That's our best shot!" They clambered through the opening, emerging into a larger chamber. But their relief was short-lived. A deafening crack split the air, and James looked up to see a massive fissure racing across the ceiling. "Move!" he roared, shoving his teammates forward as tons of concrete and steel came thundering down. They barely made it to the far side of the room before the collapse sealed off their escape route. James spun around, searching frantically for another way out. His eyes locked onto a maintenance shaft tucked away in the corner. "Through there," he ordered, already moving to pry open the access panel. One by one, they squeezed into the cramped tunnel. James took point, his rifle at the ready, while Tom brought up the rear. They inched forward on hands and knees, the shaft groaning ominously with each movement. Suddenly a blood-curdling shriek echoed through the metal walls. James' blood ran cold. He knew that sound. "Mutants!" he hissed. "They're in the vents!" No sooner had the words left his mouth than a writhing mass of tentacles and claws burst through a weak spot in the shaft ahead. James opened fire, the muzzle flash blinding in the confined space. The creature's dying screech was cut short as more of its brethren poured through the breach. "Back!" James yelled, scrambling to retreat. "We need to find another way!" They tumbled out of the shaft, only to find themselves face to face with another pack of mutants. The creatures moved with eerie coordination, cutting off escape routes and herding the humans into a corner. James's rifle clicked empty. He cursed, reaching for his sidearm. Beside him, Tom brandished a length of pipe torn from the wall. "David!" James called out. "How's Mike holding up?" But David's grim expression said it all. Mike's eyes were closed, his chest still. There was no time to mourn. The mutants charged, and the survivors fought with desperate fury. James emptied his pistol into the oncoming horde. Tom's improvised weapon became a blur, cracking skulls and shattering limbs. David used his own body as a shield, taking vicious wounds to protect his fallen comrade. Just when it seemed they would be overwhelmed, a massive explosion rocked the bunker. The floor buckled, sending mutants and humans alike tumbling into a newly formed chasm. James clung to a jutting piece of rebar, his free hand locked around Tom's wrist. David dangled precariously from Tom's other arm. With a Herculean effort, they pulled themselves up onto a ledge. The mutants weren't so lucky, plummeting into the fiery abyss below. Panting and bleeding, the survivors took stock of their situation. Mike's body was gone, lost in the chaos. James felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. They had to keep moving. "Up there," Tom said, pointing to a flickering emergency light. "That might be our way out." They climbed, every movement an agony of screaming muscles and reopened wounds. The bunker continued to shake itself apart around them, raining debris and sparks. More than once, they had to backtrack or find alternate routes as passages collapsed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the surface exit. James yanked the manual release, and the heavy blast door groaned open. The sight that greeted them stole the breath from their lungs. The sky burned an angry red, streaked with the flaming trails of orbital debris. Massive craters pockmarked the landscape, some still glowing with residual heat. In the distance, a wall of water larger than any tsunami in recorded history bore down on the continent. "My God," David whispered, what have we done?" James squared his shoulders, his teeth gritted. "We survive," he said firmly. "That's what we do. Now move." They plunged into the maelstrom, navigating a hellscape that seemed to reshape itself with each passing second. Lava flows cut off escape routes, forcing them to wade through scalding rivers of half-cooled slag. Toxic fumes billowed from fissures in the ground, searing their lungs and blurring their vision. Through it all, James kept them moving. His voice, cracked and strained, never stopped issuing commands and encouragement. Even as their strength waned and hope dwindled, he refused to let them give up. They were so focused on the immediate threats that they almost missed the distant figure stumbling towards them. James raised his weapon, then lowered it in shock as he recognized the newcomer. "Orin," he called out, disbelief evident in his voice. The Sci scientist looked half dead, his scales scorched and his breathing labored. But his eyes burned with a manic intensity. "James," Orin wheezed, "the artifact, I couldn't, we have to—" But before he could finish, a piercing screech cut through the air. A swarm of mutants, larger and more grotesque than any they'd encountered before, crested a nearby ridge. James grabbed Orin's arm, yanking him along. "Run!" he shouted. "To the caldera!" They sprinted across the broken landscape, the monstrous horde hot on their heels. Ahead, the massive volcanic crater yawned wide, a ring of shuttlecraft and escape pods scattered around its rim. As they reached the edge, James spun to face the oncoming threat. "Tom, David," he barked, "get that shuttle prepped for launch. Orin, with me. We hold the line." The next few minutes were a blur of desperate combat. James and Orin fought back to back, using every scrap of ammo and every ounce of strength they had left. For every mutant they put down, 2 more took its place. Just as their defenses were about to crumble, Tom's voice rang out. "James, we're ready!" They turned to run, but it was too late. The caldera's rim gave way with a thunderous crack. A wave of molten rock surged upward, dwarfing even the gargantuan mutants. "Go!" James roared, shoving Orin towards the shuttle. He fired his last rounds, buying precious seconds as the others scrambled aboard. With a final burst of speed, James hurled himself into the shuttle just as Tom fired up the engines. The craft lurched skyward, the hatch barely sealing before lava engulfed their former position. As they rocketed away from the doomed planet, James allowed himself a moment to breathe. He looked around at the battered, traumatized faces of the survivors. Tom, stoic as ever, focused on piloting. David, slumped in a corner, stared vacantly at nothing. Orin muttered to himself, eyes darting nervously. James turned his gaze to the view screen, watching as Deathworld tore itself apart behind them. The planet's destruction was awe-inspiring in its terrible majesty, continents shattering, and oceans boiling away in a cataclysmic spectacle. When it was over, all that remained was a slowly expanding ring of planetary debris. The shuttle drifted aimlessly, its occupants too shell-shocked to speak. It was Orin who finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain," he said, pointing to a flickering display, "you need to see this." James leaned in, his eyes widening as he processed the information. The artifact's energy signature pulsed weakly, fragmented across countless pieces of debris. "No," he breathed, "it's not over." The implications hit him like a physical blow. As long as those fragments existed, as long as their influence continued to spread, the nightmare they'd just escaped might only be the beginning. James straightened up, his mind already racing with plans and contingencies. They were battered, traumatized, and alone, but they were also the only ones who knew the true scope of the threat. He looked at his ragtag crew, human and Sci, soldiers and scientists. Whatever came next, they would face it together. James stood at the helm of the Dauntless, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The debris field stretched out before them, a chaotic maelstrom of shattered planetary fragments and twisted metal. Amidst the swirling chaos, a pulsing red dot marked their target, the largest shard of the alien artifact. "Tom, status report," James called out, his voice taut with tension. Tom's fingers flew across the console, pulling up readouts and damage assessments. "We're running on fumes, Captain. Life support's barely holding, and we've got maybe one good salvo left in the main guns. After that, we're sitting ducks." James nodded grimly. "Then we make it count. David, how are you holding up?" David winced as he shifted in his seat, fresh bandages visible beneath his tattered uniform. "I'll live. Just don't expect any fancy footwork if we need to repel boarders again." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," James muttered. He turned to Oren, who stood off to the side, his alien features unreadable. "Last chance to voice any objections, Doctor. Once we commit, there's no turning back." Oren's scales rippled, a sign of agitation. "This is madness, James. We should be trying to contain the artifact, not destroy it. The scientific potential could get us all killed." James cut him off. "Or worse, you saw what happened on Deathworld. What's happening out there right now?" He gestured to the viewport, where debris clouds writhed with unnatural motion. "We end this, here and now." Before Oren could respond, alarms blared across the bridge. Tom's eyes widened as he read the incoming data. "Captain, we've got movement. The fragments, they're converging on our position." James leaned forward, watching in horror as the tactical display came alive with swarming red dots. The debris field was coming for them, driven by an intelligence that defied comprehension. "Battle stations!" James roared. "Tom, plot us a course straight for that main fragment. David, I need every scrap of power you can give to the engines and weapons. Oren, just hold on to something." The Dauntless lurched forward, its engines straining against the growing gravitational pull of the coalescing artifact shards. James gripped the command chair as the ship plowed through waves of incoming debris. "Collision warnings!" Tom shouted. "We've got incoming hostiles, hundreds of them." Through the viewport, James watched as twisted abominations emerged from the debris clouds. Former crew members and alien fauna, warped beyond recognition by the artifact's power, hurled themselves at the Dauntless. "Defensive systems online," David reported, his voice strained. "But we can't keep this up for long." James sharpened his eyes. "We don't need long. Just get us in range of that main fragment." The ship shuddered under the onslaught. Warning klaxons blared as hull breaches opened up across multiple decks. James could hear the screeching of mutated horrors as they tore their way inside. "We're in range," Tom called out, "but our targeting systems are fried. We'll have to eyeball it." James stepped forward, taking manual control of the weapons. Through the chaos of the battle, he could see their target, a massive shard of alien technology, pulsing with malevolent energy. "Everyone brace for impact!" James shouted. He took a deep breath, steadied his hand, and fired. The Dauntless's remaining armaments erupted in a blinding flash of energy. The beam lanced out, carving through the debris field and striking the artifact dead center. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then the world exploded into light and fury. The bridge lurched violently, throwing the crew to the deck. James struggled to his feet, fighting against the groaning metal of the dying ship. Through the cracked viewport, he watched as the artifact fragment splintered and shattered, its pieces scattering into the void. But their victory was short-lived. The destruction of the main shard had triggered a chain reaction. All around them, the debris field was collapsing in on itself, reality itself seeming to warp and twist. "Hull integrity critical," David yelled over the din. "We've got minutes at best." James looked at his battered crew, human and alien alike, united in their struggle for survival. He made his decision. "Abandon ship," he ordered. "Everyone to the escape pods, now!" As klaxons blared and the Dauntless tore itself apart around them, James and his crew raced through disintegrating corridors. The fabric of space-time itself seemed to be unraveling in the wake of the artifact's destruction. What terrors or wonders awaited them, James couldn't say. But they would face it together, the last survivors of humanity's greatest test. James gripped the shuttle's controls, his knuckles tightening as he fought against the chaotic forces buffeting their craft. Tom, give me a status report on our weapons systems. Tom's fingers danced across the flickering console. Particle cannons at 15% charge, Captain. 2 torpedoes left in the tubes. James nodded. His teeth gritted. Target that large fragment. We hit it with everything we've got. The Dauntless shuddered as its remaining armaments unleashed their fury. Blue-white energy lanced out, striking the coalescing artifact shard. The torpedoes followed, detonating in a blinding flash that momentarily outshone the surrounding stars. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the universe screamed. The debris field erupted into a maelstrom of raw energy and twisted matter. Gravitational waves rippled outward, warping space itself. James watched in horror as chunks of planetary debris larger than mountains were shredded smoothly. "We've got to get out of here!" David shouted, clinging to his station as the ship bucked violently. James opened his mouth to respond, but a deafening crack cut him off. Warning klaxons blared as system after system failed. "Hull breach on decks 3 through 7, Tom reported, his voice strained. "We're venting atmosphere." James made the call. "Abandon ship. Everyone to the shuttle now." They ran through disintegrating corridors, sparks raining down from ruptured conduits. James half-carried, half-dragged Oren, the Soleil scientist babbling incoherently about cosmic forces beyond comprehension. They piled into the shuttle, just as another tremor rocked the Dauntless. James slammed his palm on the launch controls, and they shot out of the bay mere seconds before it collapsed. Through the view screen, they watched their home, their last connection to Earth, tear itself apart. The Dauntless, a ship that had weathered countless battles, finally succumbed to forces beyond mortal understanding. But there was no time to mourn. The shuttle tumbled end over end, caught in the grip of reality-warping energies. James fought the controls, trying to stabilize their trajectory, but it was like trying to sail through a hurricane of broken glass. "Tom," he shouted over the cacophony of straining metal, "divert all power to the cockpit shields and life support." Tom complied, his fingers a blur across the controls. The viewport dimmed as additional shielding snapped into place, but it did little to muffle the fury outside. David slumped in his seat, fresh blood seeping through his hastily applied bandages. "I'm out of medical," he rasped. "We're on our own if anyone else gets hurt." James nodded grimly, then turned to Oren. The alien's scales had taken on a sickly hue, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Oren, talk to me. What are we dealing with here?" Oren's gaze snapped to James, suddenly sharp with terror. "The artifact, it's rewriting reality itself. We've unleashed something primal, unknowable." Before James could press further, the shuttle lurched violently. Warning lights flashed across every display. "Hull integrity failing," Tom shouted. "We can't take much more of this." James made a split-second decision. "Seal us in, full lockdown protocol. Divert everything we've got left to keeping this tin can in one piece." They worked frantically, sealing bulkheads and rerouting power. As the final systems locked into place, an eerie silence fell over the cabin. Outside, unimaginable forces raged, but inside their reinforced cocoon, all they could do was wait. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time lost all meaning as reality itself twisted around them. They took turns watching the sensors, each shift bringing new horrors. Radiation spikes that should have liquefied their bones. Gravitational shears that by all rights should have torn them atom from atom. Yet somehow, through either miraculous human engineering or sheer cosmic chance, they endured. Oren's eyes never left the sensors, drinking in data that no mortal mind was meant to process. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with equal parts awe and terror. "A new universe being born, or perhaps the death of everything we've ever known." Finally, after an eternity of cosmic torment, the maelstrom began to subside. Systems sputtered back to life, and James dared to hope they might have survived the impossible. But as the sensors cleared and the view screen flickered back to life, that hope turned to ash in his mouth. Where Deathworld's shattered remains had been, a new celestial body now hung in space. A protoplanet of impossible composition, its surface roiling with energies that defied explanation. And they were caught in its orbit, spiraling ever closer to its volatile surface. What is that? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James studied the readings, his blood running cold. It's not a what, he said grimly. It's a where. The question is, do we run or do we fight? James stood at the helm of the battered shuttle, his eyes fixed on the swirling chaos of the protoplanet below. The view screen crackled with static, struggling to process the otherworldly energies radiating from the newly formed celestial body. We need to make a decision, and fast, Tom said, his fingers dancing across the flickering control panel. Our fuel reserves are critical. If we're going to break orbit, it has to be now. James turned to David, who was hunched over a makeshift sensor array, his face illuminated by the eerie glow of alien data streams. What are we looking at, David? Can we risk running? David shook his head, his eyes never leaving the readouts. The artifact's effects, they're not localized. I'm picking up waves of energy propagating outward at an exponential rate. If we flee, we might just be delaying the inevitable. So we're damned if we do, damned if we don't, James muttered, his hands clenching the back of his chair. Oren stood silently in the corner, his alien features unreadable. When James met his gaze, the Sci-Fi scientist simply nodded, a gesture of grim acceptance. James took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Tom, plot us a landing trajectory. We're going in. Are you insane? Tom protested, even as his hands moved to comply. That planet is a death trap. Maybe, James acknowledged, but it might be our only shot at stopping this thing before it remakes the entire universe. The shuttle shuddered as Tom fired up the remaining thrusters, shedding auxiliary systems to conserve what little power they had left. James watched as pieces of their craft broke away, trailing behind them like a comet's tail as they plummeted towards the roiling surface below. As they breached the planet's tenuous atmosphere, the true scale of the chaos became apparent. Storms of hyperacidic plasma lashed at their hull, each impact sending tremors through the ship's frame. David worked frantically at his station, rerouting power to maintain their fragile shielding. Hull temperature critical, Tom shouted over the cacophony of straining metal. We're burning up. James gripped his chair as the shuttle entered a violent spin, tumbling end over end through the corrosive maelstrom. Through the view screen, he caught flashes of a hellish landscape, oceans of molten metal, mountains that formed and crumbled in seconds, and arcs of energy that dwarfed anything he'd seen in his years of space exploration. With a sound like the world itself tearing apart, the shuttle smashed through the surface of a viscous sea. James was thrown from his seat, his head slamming against a bulkhead. Through a haze of pain and disorientation, he felt the craft skipping across the primordial ocean like a stone across a pond. When the violent motion finally ceased, James dragged himself to his feet. Status report, he called out, tasting blood in his mouth. Tom groaned from his crumpled position by the controls. We're alive somehow, but the shuttle's done for. David stumbled over, helping Oren to his feet. We need to get out of here. The hull's integrity is failing. James nodded, forcing the emergency hatch open. A wave of heat and acrid fumes washed over him as he stepped out onto the shifting surface of the protoplanet. The landscape before them defied comprehension. Vast sheets of metallic crust folded and unfolded like living origami, while in the distance, mountains of crystal grew and shattered in a continuous cycle of creation and destruction. The air itself seemed alive with crackling energies, each breath feeling like fire in their lungs. My God, Tom whispered, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and awe. James activated his suit's sensors, wincing at the sudden influx of data. We need to move, find some kind of stable ground, if such a thing exists here. They set out across the churning mineral flats, each step a gamble as the ground shifted beneath their feet. In the sky above, Massive structures of fused elements hung suspended, their shapes constantly morphing in defiance of gravity and logic. As they trudged onward, James noticed something even more unsettling. Amid the chaos of elemental transformation, patterns began to emerge. Angular formations rose from the primordial soup, pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm just beyond the edge of perception. "James!" David called out, his voice tight with tension. "You need to see this!" James joined him, staring at the readout on David's portable scanner. The data made no sense, elements transmuting and recombining in ways that should have been impossible. "It's as if the planet is building something," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before James could respond, a sound like 1,000 discordant voices filled the air. From cracks in the ever-shifting ground, strange growths began to emerge, part plant, part machine, and utterly alien. They spread with frightening speed, consuming the raw materials around them and growing into bizarrely complex structures. "The artifact," Oren spoke for the first time since they'd landed, his alien eyes wide with comprehension and fear. "It's remaking this world in its image, and it won't stop here." James watched as the alien ecosystem continued to sprout and evolve around them, a sick feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. They hadn't stopped the apocalypse. They'd only changed its form, and now they stood at ground zero of a cosmic rebirth that threatened to consume everything they'd ever known. James stood frozen, his eyes scanning the nightmarish landscape unfolding before him. The protoplanet's surface writhed with unnatural life, inchoate structures bursting from the ground and mutating at a terrifying pace. Tendrils of alien matter snaked across the horizon, consuming everything in their path. "We're too late," James whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of creation and destruction surrounding them. Oren slumped to his knees, his alien features twisted in anguish. I've doomed us all," he croaked. "The artifact's power, it's beyond anything we could have imagined." Tom frantically worked at his portable scanner, his fingers dancing across the holographic display. "Wait!" he shouted, eyes wide. "I'm picking up something. Energy signatures we might be able to exploit." James turned, hope flickering in his chest. "What do you mean?" Tom's words tumbled out in a rush. "The network, it's not fully integrated yet. If we can infiltrate the core nodes, overwrite them before they achieve autonomy, we might have a chance to abort the whole process." James looked from Tom to the hellscape around them, weighing their options. It was a long shot, but it was all they had left. "All right," James said, his mind focused. "Let's do it. What do we need?" They worked feverishly, cannibalizing what remained of their shuttle. Armor plating was welded onto a makeshift sled, thrusters jury-rigged for propulsion. As they labored, the alien landscape continued its relentless advance. David welded the final connections, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "It's not pretty, but it'll have to do." They piled onto the sled, James at the controls. With a thunderous roar, the cobbled-together thrusters ignited, propelling them across the shifting terrain. The journey was a nightmare. Clouds of mutagenic spores billowed around them, forcing them to seal their suits. Grotesque creatures, half organic and half machine, lurched from the roiling ground to attack. James swerved and dodged, while Tom and David used improvised weapons to fend off the assaults. As they neared the towering structures dominating the horizon, the attacks intensified. Swarms of metallic insects with razor-sharp appendages descended upon them. David screamed as one sliced through his suit, leaving a deep gash in his arm. "We're almost there!" James shouted, pushing the sled to its limits. They skidded to a stop at the base of a massive, pulsating obelisk. Crystalline lattices sprouted from its surface, forming intricate patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Tom immediately set to work, interfacing his equipment with the alien technology. "Cover me!" he yelled as tendrils of energy began to coalesce around them. James and David stood back to back, fighting off wave after wave of assimilating horrors. The air crackled with otherworldly energies as Tom furiously typed commands into his device. "I've uploaded the package!" Tom cried triumphantly. But his celebration was cut short as the entire structure shuddered, a deep thrumming resonating through the ground. "It's adapting!" Oren shouted, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to—" His words were cut off as a tendril of living metal wrapped around his leg, yanking him towards a pulsing archway. David lunged to help, but another tendril lashed out, tearing through his suit and sending him sprawling. "Fall back," James ordered, grabbing Tom and dragging him away from the console. They retreated, watching helplessly as Oren was pulled into the archway, his body contorting as the alien network began to assimilate him. They found momentary shelter behind a twisted spire of protomatter, their breath coming in ragged gasps. David clutched his wounded side, blood seeping between his fingers. "We've got one shot left," Tom said, his voice shaking. "But we need to get back to Oren. He's our only chance to fully transmit the kill codes." James nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. "Then let's finish this." They charged back into the fray, dodging grasping tendrils and blasts of corrosive energy. James saw Oren, half subsumed into the archway, his eyes flickering between awareness and alien hunger. "Oren!" James shouted, fighting his way closer. "We need the codes!" For a moment, Oren's eyes cleared. His mouth moved, spouting a string of incomprehensible syllables. Tom frantically input the information, his fingers a blur. "Now, Tom!" James yelled as another wave of horrors descended upon them. Tom slammed his hand down on the final command. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a shockwave of pure energy exploded outward from the archway. James watched in awe as the alien structures began to unravel, reality itself seeming to waver and blur. The world around them dissolved into chaos, time and space twisting in ways that defied comprehension. James felt himself being pulled apart and reassembled, his very atoms scattered across dimensions. When the maelstrom finally subsided, James found himself floating in the debris field where Deathworld had once been. Tom drifted nearby, both of them encased in their battered suits. The sensors showed normal readings, as if the nightmare they'd just endured had never happened. But the cost had been unimaginable. As James looked out at the shattered remnants of worlds and lives lost, he felt the weight of their actions settling over him. They had saved reality itself, but at what price? Tom's voice crackled over the comm, choked with emotion. "James, what have we done?" James had no answer. He stared into the void, the echoes of unraveled realities still ringing in his ears. They had left their mark on the universe, for better or worse. And as the last embers of human ambition faded into the cosmic night, James couldn't help but wonder what new terrors awaited them in the vastness of space.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.